Welcome back to our Mythbusters series. We have been pursuing myths and the ones that have been passed around in Christian circles and trying to match them up with biblical truth and see where things stand there. Today's myth that we're talking about is everything happens for a reason. What I've observed is that most of the time this phrase, this myth gets used at a time of grief or a time of loss. Maybe you've said those words to someone. Maybe you didn't know what else to say, and those words you used hoping they would be some source of comfort to someone else. Or maybe someone said that to you. Maybe someone was trying to comfort you with those words, everything happens for a reason. Just taking the phrase at face value, yeah, everything happens for a reason. In our world, there is this cause and effect principle that's just the way things work. One action causes a reaction. But that's not what is typically meant by people when they say everything happens for a reason. For some, it's probably some kind of concoction of religion and fate or karma or something when they say that there is some universal balance in life. I suppose if you were to talk with people maybe outside church circles, that might be a little bit of what they would mean. But for many Christians, it's more of a belief that God causes everything to happen, and that everything that happens is somehow God's will. And the underlying idea is that if God has allowed something into our lives, it must ultimately be a good thing. And given enough time, we'll figure that out. We'll eventually see what good happened because of that bad thing. And I think kind of the line of thought is this, that God is omnipotent. In other words, He's all-powerful. And God is omniscient in that He's all-knowing, and that there then can be nothing that happens that doesn't pass over God's desk before it happens. Before it can happen, God must either approve it or He must allow it. And so if something bad happens, it's because God, first of all, approved it or allowed it to happen, and therefore there is a reason for it to happen, and because God is good, the reason must be good. That's the best that I can kind of come up with, the idea behind this thing. And there's certainly a little bit of what we call theistic determinism behind it. That means that God ordains all events throughout history, that God has ordained every single event, whether it's good or whether it's bad in our lives, for some greater purpose. And I think sometimes that reasoning, we just kind of put that behind us, and those words maybe just come out without a whole lot of thought. But here's the problem with a myth like that. You've got an airliner like a couple of weeks ago, Air France jet, that crashes off the coast of Brazil, 228 people on board, all of them perish. Are we saying that went across God's desk and God gave His approval for that? Or we hear, it seems like almost weekly, about some young innocent child dying at the hands of a family member. Are we saying that God gives His approval? Or some family provider gets laid off and loses the source of income that provides for that family. Does God give His approval in those kinds of situations? I don't think it's as easy as we make it out to be, and certainly the whole idea of evil and how that works within our world is a topic we don't even have time to get into today. But here's my problem as we talk about these things, and as we talk about specifically this phrase, everything happens for a reason. I think the problem is it's not a source of comfort for hurting people. It really doesn't provide any help. I mean, that's usually when it's offered as a time of suffering, and I think often because people don't know what else to say, and they're wanting to help, and they're wanting to give some word of comfort, and they're wanting to say something that is going to be meaningful, and so they say, well, yeah, everything happens for a reason. And it comes off as a shallow cliche that has no value. It offers no comfort to someone who is hurting. And so one of my challenges today is just to let you know that and to encourage you not to use that phrase, if for nothing else. It just doesn't bring comfort to those that have suffered loss. Instead, we ought to comfort them with just our presence, and maybe we don't need to say anything at all. Maybe there's no words that are necessary, and we're just there, we hold them, we cry with them, we weep with them, and that's the way that we comfort. That's my first problem. The second problem that I've got with this is, really, it's just bad theology. It's just bad theology. Can there be some good reason for an unexpected death that leaves a grieving family? Can there really be a good reason why a child is going to come up with a terminal illness? Can there really be a good reason why a natural disaster strikes and thousands of people die? Do you think God causes calamities so He can do good? It'd be kind of like we heard a few years ago in the news, a firefighter who started a fire so he could put it out. I mean, we put people like that in jail because it's no good. It doesn't make sense. Are we saying that that's the character of God? Well, like most spiritual myths, this one comes from a misinterpretation of Scripture. Specifically, it comes from Romans 8:28, I think. And part of the problem is that in the King James translation, it reads this way: "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to His purpose." That wording, to me, sounds a little bit like a giant jigsaw puzzle that makes sense when all the other pieces kind of get put together and put into place, and we go, aha, so that's what God meant by that. But probably the New International Version gives us a little bit more of an accurate reading of Romans 8:28. It says, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose." I want you to notice the difference here. In fact, notice specifically some things that verse does not say. It does not say that God causes everything to happen. It does not say that God approves everything that happens. It doesn't say that everything that happens is good. You with me on that? God doesn't cause it. God doesn't prove everything. God is not saying that everything that happens is good. What it says is that God will work in everything that happens to bring some good from it. God will work through whatever happens to bring some good from it. In other words, you cannot prevent, Satan cannot prevent God's ultimate plan. God can accomplish His good purposes no matter what. That's a lot different from saying that everything is good or that everything is necessary. You might also notice who that promise in Romans 8:28 is intended for, to whom it's given. It's not given to everyone. It's not a blanket promise. It's not even for every Christian. There's two conditions that were given right there in Romans 8:28 for this promise, that when things happen, that God can use them for some good, that God can create some good from them. The conditions and the promises are for this: to those who love God. That was the first promise in there, or the first condition, that this is for people that love God, people that have sought God and are in a loving relationship. Secondly, those who respond to God's call. To those who love Him and who've been called according to His purpose. So two conditions here: those who love God and those who are responding to God's call. It leaves out a lot of people, doesn't it? That promise that God is going to work some good out. It leaves out those people who aren't followers of Jesus. It leaves out those people who maybe who call themselves Christians, but they're not they're not following God's call. They're not living in obedience with Him. They're not doing what He says. It's leaving out those people. Jesus, through this verse, is saying that those that love Him, who've been called according to His purpose, God's going to work those things out. So for you to offer this verse as a source of comfort to your unbelieving neighbor down the street, when some crisis happens, when he loses his job, when a child is sick, and to say that God can work some good out of that probably isn't appropriate. Because that's not the promise from God. The promise isn't for him. It's for believers who are following God. Now, to make sure that we're in some balance here, and again, I think part of the reason why some of these spiritual urban legends happen is because we take the Bible and we camp out on a specific area instead of looking at the Bible as a whole. So to make sure that we've got some balance here, I want you to write down this first point. Sometimes God does initiate or allow bad things to happen for a purpose. Sometimes that happens. We have biblical example of that taking place. We've talked about him already, a man named Job. God did not initiate that, but God allowed Satan to attack this man, and he lost his family, and he lost his possessions, and he lost it all, lost his health. God allowed that to happen. Sometimes God allows bad things to happen for us, and there's some purpose, there's some meaning behind that. Another guy that we know about in the Old Testament is a guy named Joseph, who at a young age was sold into slavery, later was falsely accused of rape, was jailed because of that, thought he was going to get an early release, but was forgotten about. Ultimately, because he was able to tell about Pharaoh's dreams, he was brought before him. And you remember there was some fear on the part of his brothers when they finally came face to face with him, and they thought, we're in trouble here. This is our brother, and he's going to pay us back. And Joseph's words in Genesis 50:20 were, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph recognized that through all that hardship, that God had some purpose woven between that, and God was saving his people because of that. God had something better in mind. There are times that God allows us to go through some things, and he recognizes that he can create something good. He can create something that is going to be better for us. But the counterbalance to that is number 2 here. Because God is in charge doesn't mean that he's the direct cause of everything that happens. Because we give God credit for being in charge and being all-knowing and all-powerful, because of that, that does not mean that everything that happens is of God or because of God. God is definitely in charge, but sometimes things happen outside of his desires. And I think what we've tried to do with this is good people have tried to salvage their view of God, their image of God, when something bad happens and they can't understand it. And so they try to explain some misfortune by saying, well, God has some hidden purpose behind this. God is allowing this suffering to take place to turn out some good in us. This suffering is going to teach us something. And so we try to come up with something positive because it must be from God. God is in charge, isn't he? But the problem is that those responses assume that God is the cause of our suffering. And they try to understand, well, why would God want us to suffer? Well, maybe there's another approach. Maybe God doesn't cause our suffering. Maybe God has not ordained that to happen. Maybe it's happened for some other reason than the will of God. I think sometimes suffering happens for other reasons than those which God has planned. In fact, I've got a couple of them written there I want you to write down. Sometimes bad things happen because of foolish decisions. Sometimes it has nothing to do with God. It has to do with a foolish choice that we made, an unwise choice. Maybe not a sinful choice, but a dumb choice. You didn't check out all the facts before you made the decision. You didn't get good advice. And so maybe it was a poor business situation or a financial investment that bankrupts the business or loses your money. Lots of people right now facing foreclosure on their homes in our country because honestly they took out a loan they couldn't afford. That's not describing everybody, but for lots of people that's the case. It was a dumb choice. It was an unwise decision. And Proverbs 19:3 tells us that people ruin their lives by their own foolishness. And I like what the writer puts after that. And then they get angry at God. We make sometimes dumb decisions. And we deal with the consequences of those. And sometimes, honestly, we want to get angry at God because He allowed it to happen when all along it was a foolish decision that we made. Sometimes, bad things happen because of sinful actions. Not just stupid choices, not just dumb decisions, but sometimes it's our sin or it could be someone else's sin and the consequences of that sinful action that are painful for us, that hurt us. A teenage girl gets pregnant. That's not God's plan, but it was a result of her sinful action. She was sexually active before being married, and something took place. There was a consequence to that. She can certainly seek forgiveness, but sometimes we still deal with the consequences of our action. We deal with the consequences of sinful action. That's why Proverbs 6:27 says, "Can a man scoop a flame into his lap and not have his clothes catch on fire? Can he walk on hot coals and not blister his feet?" All of that is written in the context of an adulterous woman and a man in his relationship with her. And it's talking about sinful sexual actions there. And the writer says, do you think you're not going to have a consequence? Certainly there's going to be something that takes place, just like putting fire into your lap. So sometimes it's foolish decisions. Sometimes it's sinful actions that we take. Sometimes bad things happen because of living in a fallen world. We live in a world that is not as God desired. We're all living with the consequences of Adam's sin. In fact, I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago. The first story after the fall of Adam and Eve is about a bad guy killing a good guy. And it's as if God from the very beginning warns us that bad things happen in a fallen world. It's going to take place. Bad people do bad things and good people get hurt. So there's a difference between what God permits and what God prefers. We're living in a time right now where God allows some things to happen. It's not what He wants, not what He prefers. He's still in charge, but those things happen. And so often our question then becomes, well, why doesn't God step in? Why doesn't God do something about it? I mean, if He's really all-powerful, why doesn't He? And I don't know that there's a good answer to that question, but there's some other questions that maybe help us with that. One of those would be, so where should God draw the line? Where do you want God to draw the line on bad people or bad behavior or bad things that happen in this world? Do you want God to stop hunger? Well, yeah, why wouldn't we want God to stop hunger? Well, how about greed? Do we want Him to stop that? What sins should God stop us from committing? If God is going to stop murder, should He also stop anger, which is typically what leads to murder? See, the problem is most people wouldn't have a problem with God removing the Hitlers of the world, but should God remove every person that does wrong? God put a stop to every person that does wrong? The Bible declares that sin is sin, but in wanting God to stop certain things from happening, a line has to be drawn somewhere. And if we were all to get together and try and come up with what that line was going to be, it would never happen. We couldn't come up with where exactly we would want God to draw the line. Where is it? At what point does God stop that sinful and that wrong and those bad actions? And maybe the question goes beyond that to this one. Do you want God to limit your free will? I found that people don't like other people to have free will, especially when their free will might harm them. But no one wants their own freedoms limited. They want to be able to choose. So do we really want God to come back right now and make everything right? When really we understand that the only reason that He delays is so that more of His enemies become His friends. That's what the Bible tells us, that God is patient. God one of these days is going to make everything right. God's going to make everything just, but He's holding off. He's holding off just a little longer so that those that don't know Him have the opportunity to come to Him. Everything happens for a reason. Well, does it? I've been told that a divorce was a part of God's plan because the new marriage, the second marriage, was a happy one. I've been told that a church split was orchestrated by God because it led to the start of a dynamic new ministry. I've been told that God was a part of criminal activity and the subsequent imprisonment of somebody because that offender met the Lord in prison, and that was God's plan, and God worked it out, and everything happens for a reason. But if we look at a bigger picture of God, God doesn't approve of sin. Ever. He doesn't approve of it. He doesn't cause it. He doesn't even use it. The Bible tells us He overcomes it. That He can take sinful action, and He can take wrong decisions, and He can take a fallen world, and He can redeem it, because that's what grace does. That's what God does. He's in the plan of redemption. That's what grace does. It takes those things that weren't planned, that weren't orchestrated, but it creates some good from them.